Okay, and we are live. Welcome back, everybody, to the Revo Report. I'm Vince Revo, your host. Today, we have an amazing guest. He's a best-selling author. He's a podcaster, Eschatology Matters, Base Boomers podcast. You got to check that out. I have his book here, Going Back to Find the Way Forward. Trump, A Great Awakening, and the Refounding of America. I think, personally, you guys will be blown away with what he has to share today. It might just change your perspective. So without further ado, why don't we go ahead and welcome in our guest, Mike DiVirgilio.
Perfect.
Welcome, Mike. Welcome to the Revo Report. We're inspiring faith with reason and reason with faith. That applause was a little delayed there. Well, welcome, Mike.
No, I don't get applause normally, so I get boos. So that was I'm grateful for that.
Right on. Well, welcome, Mike. How's your day going?
It's going blessed.
Amen. What I want to get to is, how did your spiritual journey in Christianity, in your relationship with God, lead you to write about Donald Trump and a great awakening? Because I don't think a lot of people would have Donald Trump and a great awakening even in the same sentence 30 years ago.
Right? I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's so fun. I wrote, my previous book was about how the Bible could not be made up. It's called Uninvented, how the Bible could not be made up in evidence, the evidence that proves it. And one of the things that God always seems to do is choose the most unlikely people. You know, you just read through it and you're going, really? This is what he's using? Yes. Because his glory is paramount, because he's God after all. So he gets the glory, and he loves sharing that with us. But unless we get that right, if we seek glory for ourselves, it's just not going to happen. And Trump, so I was born in 1960, so I grew up, as an adult in the 80s, and Trump was ubiquitous. He was everywhere. 90s, had all his issues, but he was Trump, and he was a heathen. And I despised the man, literally. I mean, he just, this guy,
And a lot of conservatives would say the same thing. A lot of Christians would say.
Christians, right. He's a womanizer. He's blah, blah, blah. He's narcissistic. He's materialistic. I would have had nothing. Well, I did have nothing good to say about him. So when he comes down the escalator, which now I look at as kind of a world-changing event, the first sentence in my book is, when Donald Trump came down the escalator, there was a rip in the space-time continuum. I mean, nobody knew. And it took me a long time. In October of that year, I told my wife, Donald Trump will never be president. I'm a prophet. But I listened to some people. Well, two things happened. One was the people with TDS, or Trump derangement syndrome, were so over the top, I thought to myself, nobody can be that evil. I mean, it's just not possible. And I started to become aware of his family, and his children were well-adjusted, ran his businesses, and loved their dad.
That's
okay.
Right.
You don't pull that off if you're some psycho narcissist. You just don't do that. And then I listened to Hugh Hewitt and Larry Arnn. Every Friday they have my daughter went to Hillsdale College, and I've been in love with Hillsdale since I was in college. And they have Hugh for Hillsdale every Friday. And they started talking about it, and Larry Arnn was talking dispassionately, and I'm going, okay. A year after he came down the escalator, we lived in Illinois at the time. We live in the Tampa, Florida area now. And I voted in the Illinois primary. And I was ambivalent. I didn't know, if my mother-in-law had to talk me into voting for Trump. And it was Cruz or Trump. And so I did. When I voted, I kind of felt guilty. And yet, I haven't looked back since. And just to see what's happened, I wouldn't have connected Great Awakening or anything spiritual to Trump. I mean, that's just not, But 4 years, you see lies upon lies upon lies. And, well, the election was compromised, let's put it that way, of 2020, which the Democrats was the worst thing they ever did for themselves, was not allow Trump to win that second term, because it would have been nothing like this second term. And then we have January 6th. And as I talk about in the book, I find Steve Bannon's War Room, which was God's providence, because I was as depressed as I've ever been. I thought, the left's done this for 4 years. Now they've actually gotten away with it. And Bannon, as I say, got me out of the fetal position into mixed metaphors. He talked me off the ledge, because he has no time for thumbsuckers, no time for winter soldiers or sunshine patriots. He's all about the fight. And I love the guy. And I still watch him most every day. But the thing that happened was he affirms, Bannon does this all the time, he's a Roman Catholic, is that he affirms our agency, that we can actually change things. We're made in God's image. Of course we can change things. And I was such a pessimist, my eschatology was that way, that I kind of mocked myself for thinking like little old me could change the world. Well, that's why God made us, was to change the world. That's what he did to Adam and Eve. And he says, right, be fruitful and multiplied, dominion over the earth, right? You're going to shape and mold this for my glory and your good. And that hasn't stopped as a command of God. So slowly but surely, I got really kind of optimistic, and I would see Bannon would have people come through his posse, as he calls it, through his show, and he would interview them, and just average, normal people going out doing stuff to change things. There was a point in early 22 when I thought, why am I so optimistic? And I wanted to see from a biblical Christian perspective. So I tell my wife, I was thinking of writing another book, and I go, I should write a book about this. And she goes, well, go for it. So that was kind of the beginning of that journey to start. And as it went on, and then to see what they did to him, continuing to do to him, and trying to throw him in prison, and then obviously trying to shoot him and whatever, I began to see people waking up from COVID. And I talk in the book about truth being the dividing line in Western culture, because leftists don't care about the truth. They just care about their ideology. They care about the narrative and their political power. That's all. So they will lie out their teeth as long as it gets them what they want. And true liberals who are really liberal care about truth. So a lot of those, I talk about that a little bit in the book, is they were red-pilled. They were like, huh. And they sort of moved over to, Elon Musk, Joe Rogan, right? We were talking about Rogan. I mean, they're not all the way to Jesus yet, but I'm praying for him, because
RFK.
Right.
Yeah.
Completely. And truth, the reason we believe that truth is so profound is because it's not just the nature of things, it's Jesus. It's a person, right? So it has metaphysical and spiritual implications. And if you believe in the truth, that you're actually closer to him, right? Just by believing in it. And then we can always point because all truth points back to the truth, all of it. I don't care what it is. It's science, it's gardening, it's art, it's politics, economics, all of it points back. That's why everything's spiritual, right? Everything. So you just started to see this. And I talk about Naomi Wolf, who's a secular Jew, feminist, liberal. She started showing up on Steve Bannon's show. And I'm like, wow, this is bizarre. And she ended up coming back to her faith. She's not all the way to the Messiah yet, but she came back because she saw the nature of evil in COVID. She saw it as so evil that it couldn't just be made up by bumbling humans on the mere level of politics. There's a devil, there's a God. That idea of a great awakening just slowly, and you begin to see people embracing the faith who you just wouldn't think, And the internet, the Gutenberg press of the 21st century has been remarkable in allowing the gospel and truth to go forth. It all happened. A lot of people would say, this is just a coincidence and this is happening and that happened. But when he turned his head in Butler, Pennsylvania on July 13th, and that bullet grazed his ear as opposed to blowing his brains out on, national TV and such, even atheists were tempted to say there's something spiritual or God going on here.
Right.
And and as we're recording this, last night was it wasn't called a State of the Union, but he spoke to Congress, and just to see what he's doing is and for me, a boomer who's been pessimistic. I've been part of Con Inc., as I told you, conservative movement just loses, and the progressives and the statists, they just grow and grow and grow. The culture gets more and more corrupt and more godless. And then,
he's doing this radical shift.
I just dropped, as you say nowadays, a podcast and a blog post that we went from negative world to positive world in one day. And I don't know if you're familiar with Aaron Renn. He has a taxonomy. It was positive. He's a Christian, and he wrote an article for First Things a few years ago called The Three Worlds of Evangelicalism. For most of American history, Canadian history as well, we had positive world because Christianity was seen as a net positive for the culture, right? Then went to neutral world in the 90s, Clinton and that on. So Christianity isn't bad or anything, but it's just neutral. Stay in your closet, your home and church, and you'll be fine. And then he says 2014. But with Obama in 2008, negative world commenced.
Yeah, Christians are the enemies.
Exactly. We're bad. Everything about us is bad, bad, bad.
Yeah. The new atheist movement really started to make a push then.
Right. all of it. And then Trump was elected. There's been a shift, and it's mind-blowing. The first cabinet meeting he had, he asked one of the guys in the room, I think he's a pastor, I think he's one of his cabinet secretaries, but he asked him to pray. He turns to the guy and goes, would you say grace for us? And he prayed in Jesus' name. It's like, really? And that's the idea of positive world, that Christianity is a net benefit. And people know this is thing we have to sell, because secularism is dead. It started in 1637 when René Descartes said, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And then rationalism, the thing that we can get to all truth and anything we need to know via reason. And that started the push for secularism, which grew and grew in the 19th century and then took over the Western world in the 20th. We've reached the end of that. It's been weighed in the balance and found wanting, and people need more than what a persona non grata, godless society can give them. They're looking for meaning, hope, and purpose. And that's where people are realizing, well, maybe this Jesus thing is like, and they're realizing that it gives society, like Tom Holland wrote a book called Dominion. And then all of the good stuff in Western culture comes from Christianity, not from paganism or the Enlightenment, So
and we're seeing that even right now in the UK. You have even Richard Dawkins calling himself a cultural Christian, right? You have Alex O'Connor saying, well, I'm a culturally Christian person. And, I remember when, this was like 10 years ago, when my pastor visited us because they were preaching out here. And he said, this is when Trump started kind of making that push up. And we was going to start running for presidency. And he goes, what do you think of Trump? And one of my replies was, if the media is saying how evil he is, and everybody, they are so against him. They are so against him that I'm questioning, is he the good guy actually?
For you.
This was, so long ago. And then seeing what's happening now and what's happening with Christians really rising up and being now unafraid to speak. I think that's what we're seeing, right? Where Christians are going, you know what, I'm going to speak up. And exactly. I think that's it's triggered some kind of courage within Christendom as a whole, within the Catholics, the Orthodox, the Protestants. And I love what you were saying when you said, actually we can affect change. There's this song, I forget who wrote it, but one of the lyrics is, God, there's this happening here, and there's starvation, and there's wars, and there's people suffering, and there's people in pain. And then the lyric goes, God, why don't you do something? And God responds, and God says, I did. I created you. Amen. And I thought that was so, that resonates with me because, God did do something. We don't have to just sit on the sidelines. We're not the water boys. We're in the game. We can get in the games. One of those things is, yes, through prayer, but also through action, through speaking up, through standing up for our faith, right? And I think for so long, like you said, when Christians were that negative, where we were seen as, the evil ones. I remember it was over 10 years ago, 11 years ago, we were flying to Canada and we got called to pastor here in Toronto. And I remember having a conversation with this girl on the plane, and my wife and I were having this great conversation with this girl. And so finally conversation leads to, what do you guys do? Well, why are you going to Canada? And my wife goes, my husband's going over there to pastor. And then all of a sudden this wall came up and she's just stopped talking to us the rest of the plane trip. And I thought, okay, well, that's odd. I was washing up, as we landed in Pearson International, I was washing up and I was having this conversation with this guy who's an engineer, and we talked about his trip out in the Dominican and how he had a great time. And we were really clicking. He goes, I go, yeah, we should connect, man. We should hang out sometime, And he goes, yeah, absolutely. By the way, what do you do? And I go, I'm going to be pastoring at a church in Toronto. And he goes, yeah, well, I'll see you later, man. I'll see you. It's connected from me. And I thought, what is going on? And that's what it was. It was Christians are evil, and because of Christians, we have all this evil and suffering, and they're taking away all of our freedoms, etc. And you're right. Now, all of a sudden, the tide has turned, right?
Who I give a lot of credit to is Jordan Peterson, because there's this concept called plausibility structures, which is, the word plausible just means whatever seems real, seems true. It just seems, whether it is or not is irrelevant. It's just whether it seems so. So when we were in negative world, Christianity seemed like it's bad, right? It's tyrannical and so on and so forth. But when you have Jordan Peterson, and his reach is incredible, starting to build credibility into the biblical message, regardless of his, his actual beliefs. And I know he psychologizes everything. It's irrelevant. We
But
pray
do you know
for
that
him.
recently he did, but he was on a podcast and he said, I believe in the resurrection. I believe that Jesus literally raised from the dead. This is just recent.
I haven't heard that.
This
Great. What he did was he, like we say nowadays, moved the Overton window, right? Christianity now as something that is plausible for societal flourishing, right? Because the image that has been painted really since Marx, because for Marx, the enemy was Christianity, right? He's going to abolish 4 things, and one of those is religion, which is really meant Christianity, because that was keeping people from true consciousness, revolutionary consciousness, and so on and so forth. And then the left has hated us ever since. They grew more secular, and then in the 60s, of course, that all exploded, and this was pushed, that our nations are evil fundamentally, right? Because we're Christian, we're white. Those of us, I'm not even actually technically white, I'm Italian, I'm Sicilian. Because of what he did, that opened the doors for other people on many different levels, just as the kind of the ether, people are kind of smelling and sensing. Christian equals positive. Christian equals good. Christian equals, and that's critical, And then would you say what you want about Trump? Like, I don't judge the man's soul. That's not my job. But, he affirmed, even if he brings Paula White into his whatever council, who cares? Christians on my side are like, oh, Paula White, who cares? This is not theology in chief. This is government. And just the fact of faith, as being something that's relevant now. And that's because secularism is dead. It's just that I can't say that enough. I've sold my kids on the value of Christianity because it's the truth. And selling and I say selling because that's what I do for a living. I sell technology. But my first book's called The Persuasive Christian Parent. I needed to persuade my kids all their lives that Christianity is true. That's the only reason we believe it. I don't care what it does for me. I just want to know, is it true or not? And in secularism...
And how many kids do you have, Mike?
Okay, so I have 3 children. If I knew what I know now, I would have had more. But God is gracious. So my youngest is 22. He got married when he was 21, which is wonderful. Then my middle son is 29, single, and my oldest daughter's 33, and we just had our 3rd grandchild, 20th of February. Yeah.
Wow.
You see pictures of her, makes me cry. But our covenant children, God is doing it generationally. And that's what we have to think. Because we're building cathedrals we're not going to worship in. And that's kind of where we are, right? We're doing something.
How have you raised them in a way so that they could stand firm on their faith? Because there's a lot of kids who grew up in the church and then by the time high school hits, and they've got these woke teachers and indoctrinating them, all of a sudden, they're showing them these books by Dawkins and by Sam Harris, etc., and then they walk away from that. That's what happened with me. So how have you raised your kids in a way to really ground them?
Yeah, I'm interested to hear your story, because as listeners may or may not know, Vince was on the Ex-Skeptic podcast, and I've listened to all 110 or so of Jana Harmon's interviews of atheists.
Oh, wow,
and
you have.
skeptics. Yeah, everyone. Because I'll get to your question, but you can't explain the transformation in people's lives by mere psychology. I mean, the atheist materialist has to do that, right? They have no other choice. When you hear I love hearing testimonies, because I've listened to hundreds of them, and everyone is different. Because in Matthew 1:21, Jesus, this is one of the reasons I'm Reformed Calvinist, is Jesus says, he's given his name because the angel says to Joseph, because he will save his people from their sins. So God is going to save those he died for. And it just blows my mind to see that, So when I became a Christian because when I was 18, because I believed it was true. If God's real, he deserves my all. That was when I told myself. And a couple years later, I came across Francis Schaeffer's The God Who Is There. Are you familiar with Schaeffer?
Yes.
And
yes.
That book blew my mind, because it showed me not only a total Christian worldview, that Christianity applies literally to everything. I can defend my faith as true, the veracity of it. This is an aside that in the early 80s, when Schaeffer was becoming more politically engaged, Christians at the time were saying, oh, he's getting involved in politics. He shouldn't be doing that. Yeah. He's over blah, blah, blah. It's like, praise God for him. So I just naturally, when our kids were born, taught them that Christianity is the truth. when I was almost 55, it was May and 15, and the nuns, I don't know if you've heard of that phrase, not N-U-N, but N-O-N-E-S. Have you heard that? So before Trump sucked all the air out of the media, in 14, 15, there was a lot of news about the nuns because they would do surveys about, what religion are you? And they would put the choices and then they would say none of the above. So the media started running with the nuns, and it's growing, and, Christianity's crumbling. Of course, the media, secular media, is going to say that, right? And they're overjoyed. And there were so many stories. And then one day I read this article about a young lady. She grew up in a Christian home. I mean, very involved. This is not like nominal Christian. So she goes off to the University of Virginia and instantly becomes an agnostic. And she writes a piece about this. And I read it and I thought, it ticked me off, frankly. I go, that would never happen to my children. And I was going to write a blog post, and then I think, well, why don't I write a book? And so that's kind of the book grew out of that. It took several years because I never done it before. But
so it was really for your kids.
Yeah. I just say, how did I do this? And I got pushback because people would say, well, Mike, you think you can guarantee that your kids stay Christian? That's not right. And, I said, no, that's not the point. The point is, I can guarantee, none of us can guarantee anything, and we're in control of nothing. God put us in a cause and effect universe. Yes. So he said, you reap what you sow. Is that 100%? No. Right? But we can have a reasonable expectation. If we sow X, we'll get Y. And that's the same with our children. And in a secular age, it is so much more important to teach our kids that Christianity is the truth and why, and that there's good evidence behind that, than to teach them how to sing a hymn or to teach them good theology. Now, we should do both. And I was terrible at the spiritual stuff. I really wasn't good, singing and doing devotions with them. If you're going to err on either side, err on teaching them the truth, because you can take them to church, Sunday school, and if they don't believe in their gut of guts that Christianity is the truth, then all bets are off. But if you teach them it's the truth, and there's so much evidence, it's just ridiculous. And then you compare that to the explanatory power, which is a phrase I love. What it best explains anything. Right? The explanatory power of Christianity versus secularism is like, there's just no comparison. It's like the Titanic to dinghy. It's just insane. It's just a joke. It's comical how little appealing secularism should have to our children. I messed with the title quite a bit for the book. It's The Persuasive Christian Parent. And I ended up, the subtitle as being God's provision for building an enduring faith in you and your children. God has given us everything we need for life and godliness through our knowledge of Him. He's given it all. And it's just interesting to see the new atheists were, boom, right? They were it culturally. And they're gone. And now they're even saying, like you said, they're saying, well, we're cultural Christians, because they realize Christianity brings flourishing and goodness.
That's right.
Lies don't do that, so it's true.
Our eldest is 10 and our youngest is 3. And the deal that we have with our eldest right now is that he can watch YouTube if the first thing that he watches is something on Christian apologetics. And we have some of these really great YouTubers out there like Redeemed Zoomer, which hopefully I'll have on the show, creating this contact for the Gen Z, Gen Alpha, that is Christian apologetics, but it's really in kind of their form factor. I said, okay, watch something on Christian apologetics and then watch something on science or whatever else. But the first thing is you have to learn how to defend your faith, because people are going to challenge it. So blessed to hear you say that. And if I may ask, all of your 3 kids now, are they still followers of Jesus Christ?
Absolutely Jesus freaks.
Amazing.
One of the things as I was writing that book, and you could tell that Christian families' parents were concerned about the culture and how negative it was. Just all the bad influences, but also toward Christianity. And I argue, and in fact, I have a section in the book, a couple of chapters, that the culture is our children's best friend. And you're thinking, well, really? How? Because the culture communicates certain things. And what I taught them is you have to interrogate the culture. You question it like it's... Remember how C.S. Lewis wrote a book? Well, they put together a bunch of his essays called God in the Dock. And in England, that's the one sitting, being interrogated, right, in a court of law. He's in the dock. And so the atheists have done that to us for 300 years. God, you this, and God, you have to do this. Started with Voltaire, with the Great Lisbon earthquake in 1755. And God was always on the dock ever since. but we need to turn the tables and put the secularists and the atheists in the dock.
Right.
We need to interrogate them. No, you have to defend yourself of what you believe is the truth, right? Because there's no unbelief. We all have faith in something. And so I would use TV I call it the power of the clicker, the remote control. Everything we watched growing up, you could never get 10 minutes in without me stopping it and asking them questions or lecturing them about whatever was being communicated. Now I do it. My kids are grown. My wife gets all the lectures. I said, now I got an outlet in Twitter and YouTube so I try not to lecture her as much. But I can't help it because I look at stuff and I'm constantly critiquing it and how weak it is, how the secular worldview is pathetic. So, yeah, we could go down that rabbit hole for a long time. So,
what would you say? Actually, you know what? Before I get to this question, I have a question for you that I've really been thinking on, and it's this. So what's happened recently at the White House with Zelensky and President Trump? I want to get your thoughts on this. Some people are saying, "Oh, well, Trump is pro Putin, he's an agent of Russia, et cetera, et cetera." And you've seen all these videos come out now about that and how he's destroying NATO because he's a communist, et cetera, et cetera. What's your take on what just happened? I know this is not in my official questions, but I just want to get your thoughts on it. What's your take on what just happened with Zelensky and Trump right now, and what's happening internationally?
Well, I'm honored that you would ask me the question just to think I have something valuable to say. So if we go back to 2000 before Trump came down the escalator, Putin wasn't the ultimate evil in the universe. Even Obama said, well, once I get reelected, I don't know if you remember this, in 2012, he was caught, and he says, I'll have more room when I win the election to negotiate, to be flexible, right? At some point, after, as soon as Trump, it actually happened before because Hillary Clinton's campaign purchased the Steele dossier and all this stuff that just lie upon lie upon. So we now can hang Putin around Trump's neck, and Putin becomes Hitler because, of course, Hitler was the most evil person in the world, although Stalin and Mao killed far more. But Hitler is the guy because then he can be hung around conservatives' neck more easily. So Putin has continued to be the bogeyman, and he's not a good man by any means, right? But he has no desire to take over Europe, right? That's an excuse that they use, that the Europeans and NATO use to go to war. And they're pushing the NATO further and further to the east, and he's saying, don't do that. Stop. And, even people like Kamala Harris saying we should put Ukraine in NATO. That's a non-starter for him. And it would have been very simple if Trump had been elected to negotiate that, and over 1 million people would still be alive today, But for whatever reason, the military-industrial complex profits from war, and they've utilized Zelensky, and it's tragic on so many levels that it just doesn't have to be. I've been red-pilled about many things related to war, and I mean, my gosh. So this is just the same narrative, right? Putin's Hitler, and I don't believe Hitler was determined on world conquest either, right? But so that's the narrative, though, that you have to accept it. And so then anybody they compare to Hitler is now world conquests. We got to go to World War III. And Trump just wants to be blessed is the peacemaker. It's not that hard. So that was something that actually was a good thing to see this play out in real time. And they didn't plan that because for 30 minutes it was going fine, I guess. And then, and he became this just like the Democrats, petulant little children. If you saw them last night, they're just sitting there, kids healed of cancer of the brain, and they're sitting there like this, and they won't clap.
Yeah, one of the things that Trump said was that they've never applauded, they've never stood up for anything so far, even if it was good for the U.S. Even if it was
he could cure cancer, and they would boo.
Yeah, that's what he said, right? Yeah.
But this is part I mentioned before we went on, live, that God's judgment. See, too many people see God's judgment as something that just brings destruction. God's going to judge America or whatever. And, maybe. But God's judgment to me, and I'm reading through Isaiah with John Calvin slowly, and it's so interesting because God is constantly saying this bad stuff's going to happen, then there's going to be redemption. It's like judgment isn't the end. And one of the things God does in judgments, he gives people what they want. So he's given the left everything they wanted. And, for 4 years, they had all the cultural and all the political power in America. The whole West, really, right? And then they couldn't help themselves because that's, again, God's judgment. And they kept, there was a vote in the Congress, I think it was the Senate. I'm not sure if it was the House or the Senate or both, against having men and women's sports. And not one Democrat voted for it.
Wow.
It's like an 80, 20, 90, 10, popularity thing. And they're still against it because they're and God is having mercy on the rest of us by letting them be revealed for who they are. And that was the argument in my book. The left can't help it. They're Marxists fundamentally. And there's just, they're going to do what Marxists do. And thankfully, because that's exposed itself. And that's happening on an international level as well as on many levels,
What would you say to some Christians who are saying that, because I'm sensing that there is a great awakening happening as well, right? But what would you say to some Christians who might say that actually there is no great awakening happening right now? All that's happening is that those that are Christian, they're just speaking up. So it looks like there's people converting and becoming more Christian or becoming more passionate about their faith, but actually it's not. It's just the same people, the same population. They're just speaking up right now.
Well, I hope that's true. In the sense that people are speaking up, right? Yeah. But no, that's not no, there are people that are professing faith that never have before and on a level that they haven't before, So, and that's partly, we know that by the internet. People aren't keeping like Russell Brand in England, to me was shocking. It shouldn't have been, but he's on my heathen prayer list and God brought him to faith and it's real. Yeah. It's real substantial faith. And he has got millions of followers and he's just, solid as a rock. And that matters. That builds the plausibility structure I mentioned, right? It really does. Yeah. People who are non-Christians start going, I don't know how many people I've heard come to faith in Christ because of Jordan Peterson. That he's not an Orthodox, Nicene, perfect Christian, doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. There's like, oh wow, this Bible thing is kind of heavy. It's kind of, Tucker Carlson is a great example. He's a nominal Episcopalian. And then last year he decided, I'm going to start reading the Bible through cover to cover. And he says, I grew up in a secular world, He said 5 years ago, we would have never had these kind of conversations, ever. And now every conversation I have is about God. So there's no way you can downplay this. But I also say that this Great Awakening, and this is where pietism, which is a 17th century German Lutheran movement, which was a reaction to scholasticism, which is simply kind of a dry, intellectual, academic kind of approach to the faith. So there was this reaction, and it was eventually called pietism. And the First Great Awakening was kind of a result of this. And through John Wesley, it basically took over the church. And you have the Second Great Awakening. But those awakenings happened in Christian culture, right? Thoroughly. Christian Protestant cultures, and they were primarily spiritual, church going and so on and so forth. This Great Awakening is quite a bit different because it's awakening to truth on so many levels in a secular, thoroughly secular culture, right? Yeah. So, like I mentioned, the truth has metaphysical implications. It has spiritual implications. So people being red-pilled about their health and about big pharma and big food, and how the earth, okay, I want to tell you a great example of how this works. I take this stuff called beam minerals. So I had my red pill health experience, and in May of 21, it just really started to take off. My sister introduced me to these things called beam minerals. They're fulvic and humic minerals. We don't get enough minerals from the soil. Well, last year at some point, I emailed the company, and some guy said, the owner would like to get on a call with you. I go, wow, that's cool. So we got on, we were talking, and she's explaining the human cell and the intricacy of it. And, I'm just going, that's God. That's what I said to her. And she goes, yeah, I still believe in evolution, but it's so complex that I just said, yeah, God. That's what's happening. That kind of stuff, I don't know what God will do with that in her life, but you put a pebble in the shoe, but you can't deny that anymore. That's where the quote new atheists, they've lost that. The complexity of everything is saying God, 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 Romans 1, So again, I don't know where I was totally going with that, but it's, the Great Awakening, it's so different than the others. And so you can say that, this gal or Naomi Wolf isn't to Jesus yet, but that's not the point. We're building a culture, re-Christianizing it to where believing in Jesus once again becomes not only acceptable, but maybe like something that people like want to do. That's a good thing, and apologetics. I got into apologetics in the 80s. I went to Westminster Seminary and learned a different kind of apologetics there. And I got out of it for about 20 years. And in 2009, I got back into apologetics big time and found out that there was an explosion of resources. So, at every level, there's so much God is bringing. So my argument is a theology of history and the providence of God. That's chapter 3. Because as Christians, we understand God is in control of all things. I don't care if you're a Calvinist or what you are, right? We all know that, any Christian. And he is moving the chess pieces. I say God leaves breadcrumbs in history, and we could point. Sometimes it's so obvious, like Trump turning his head. And sometimes it's just smaller stuff. Sometimes it's even big, like Dawkins saying I'm a cultural Christian, and the internet just multiplying that message. And so there's no doubt there's a great awakening. I don't just pray for revival anymore. I call it the 4 R's. I pray for revival, renewal, restoration, and reformation, because we need to raise up Christians who are taking their faith into everything. Theft is against the 10 Commandments, right? And to use the government to steal our money, it's a Christian value. That efficiency and getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse, that's something Christian, right? That is very, very Christian and biblical. And that's the way we need to frame things, because people like Musk needs to see, hey, we're doing this because Christianity, Elon, worldview with no God, it doesn't really matter, right? Lying and stealing and cheating is not wrong in a materialist world. So and you talk about the red pill, this red pill moment. When we talk about the red pill, what for you is, in your personal experience of this awakening, what moment really changed your perspective? Was it COVID or was it something else? And how did that moment change your outlook or what you engaged in from a personal level, and also how your overall perspective on things? I believe that back in college, I was involved in this ministry called the Navigators, and a really dedicated group of Christians. And when I left, I went back home. I was born and raised in LA, and I went to Arizona State. And the ministry leader there, we had lunch the day I left, and he says, God gave me this morning in his quiet time, he gave me a verse for you, Psalm 48:14, which says, this God is our God, and he will be our guide even to the end. And I see this red pill developing well before that. It started really in 2009, because I've always been committed. Like I said, I've defended the faith to my kids, gone to church every Sunday forever, and prayed and read the Bible as best I could. But, you go through dry periods or whatever, at least I did, and Christianity didn't seem as real to me. And 2009 is when I took my deep dive back into apologetics. I bought a little MP3 player, which I still use. And then in 2012, I made a decision. I said, no matter how bad I feel, I'm going to get on my knees and pray and read the Bible every morning. That was the beginning. That was the true, because I've done that, I do that. And God became more real to me. I mean, real in a way that you can't even explain the realness of it. And so I see God as working in me, and then Trump, because that really was the next step, and beginning to see the bigger picture of truth and the lies. And so you're seeing a cosmic battle, really, the Ephesians 6, we wage not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual powers and so on. And seeing this happen, it really was the ultimate, because I talk about Babel a lot. I think I mentioned it 39 times. And this idea of the concentration of power. And we have that today in the globalists. And God says, if I let them get away with this, then nothing they do will be impossible for them. The pride and so on. And so he did let the globalists get away with it in COVID. As I argue that hubris, this overweening pride, always leads to nemesis. The ancient Greeks talked about that. Eventually, this hubris, this pride is going to be your downfall. And you could see that with COVID. Like I say, in the middle of the storm, it's hard to see anything other than the storm. But when you look back at it, like all of life, 2020, hindsight, you can see it. And COVID was the thing that woke up so many people, and in a spiritual way. It's so bizarre, isn't it? Modern medicine it's great on a lot of levels, but it's been a disaster on so many levels. And just this rule by experts, I talk about progressivism and this growth of the expert class, and we see it in the administrative state and managerial control of everything. And it's just horrible. And it just was revealed. That's all I can say about it. I think I was going to call the book initially Trump the Great Revealer. But it wasn't. He wasn't doing the revealing. It was God, right? He was. This was being revealed to see in relief, and the journey doesn't stop, right? I mean, my mind's continuing to be open to things. I never continually tweaking what I believe about things and learning new things. And it's interesting that God in 1 Corinthians 8:2, Paul says, "The man who thinks he knows something does not yet know as he ought to know." And that doesn't call for skepticism, because in the first verse he says, "And we know." We know things, right? But it calls for epistemological humility. So we can know really, but we should not hold on to what we know so tightly as if our being right about whatever it is the most important thing in the world. Because then what's your faith in? It's not in God. It's in my rightness, how smart I am. And I get this. The other idiots don't get it. So
that kind of brings me to another question that I have for you. Trump is very polarizing, not just the right and to the left, but also within Christendom, because you have Christians who are all for it, right? They're all for, yes, USA, MAGA, but then you have other Christians who are saying, you know what? Can't we see that he's not for God? Can't you see that Jesus said, you will know them by their fruit? And we're not seeing that fruit in Trump. He's deceiving everybody. Why do you think that he is so polarizing in that sense? And what would you have to say to those Christians who are saying, forget Trump, he's obviously not for Christians, this is just part of some other, conspiracy, etc.?
Well, I'd say they're wrong, first of all. I mean, first of all, they don't know the man. That's one of the things that, again, no one despised Trump more than me. I'm telling you, I take the sweepstakes in Trump despisement. I mean, really. I would even go so far as to say he disgusted me. But I didn't know the man. I didn't know anything about him. I didn't know his story. I just knew the caricature. And for me, that was bad enough. And then you have his children. You have his grandchildren. To me, the family and children they say in a court of law, they use a phrase called, that's dispositive. That's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So that alone tells me this man has more character than I gave him credit for. There's something about this guy. He's bizarre. He's a strange dude. All very successful people are, right? They're different. But there's just something about him that people like him who know him. The people he worked with. He's being a builder. He knows average people. He's for average people, right? And those Christians are, I don't want to call them pharisaical and self-righteous, but maybe they are. Maybe they think they know something about the man because of a caricature, and the fact that he says things she says, you got to know when to take Trump seriously, not literally. Literally, not seriously, right? He says things to get, it's the art of the deal, to get a reaction, right? And like Trump Gaza, I don't know if you saw that video. My daughter, who's had taken a long time to come to anything positive about Trump, but she's still on board. But still, it's like, she's like, "Oh, did you see that? It's horrible." I said, "That's just perfect Trump troll. I mean, it's perfect." Would you rather have, this dystopian nightmare of death and destruction everywhere, or Trump Gaza? I mean, But
even Canada, right? Just riling up Canada and saying, our Governor stuff. Trudeau and the 51st state.
Yeah, and it's just to make points. It's the art of the deal. So you can say whatever you want about it, but it's so effective. And when you talk about polarizing, isn't it interesting that the polls are moving continually further to the right? speaking conservatively, MAGA, Trump. Because last night, right, it was like 70+% approval of his speech.
Really?
That's a CBS poll. Yes. CBS poll.
Wow.
And you start seeing things because the worst nightmare for the Democrats and the left and the never Trump Christians is that what Trump is doing is going to work. It's actually going to work. It's going to bring peace and prosperity, right? And undeniably, there is a Christian move. Whatever you say about his faith, he is totally affirmative about the faith. Whereas Biden and the Democrats are Marxists and they hate Christianity. They just do. It's their enemy. And Trump is all for America. Red, white, and blue, apple pie, just average folks trying to make a living, And so you've heard the phrase Big Eva or the evangelical establishment. Have you?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Right. Well, there's just like Christianity Today is a good example. Wheaton College. There are these basic publishing houses.
Like Big Pharma? Is that? But
that's the slam, right? Tim Keller was, one of those. I learned a ton from him and loved his work. But after Trump, he just started to third wayism. I talk about that in the book too. Is that it's the extremes of the left and the right, and we don't want to be on the extremes. There's no extreme right. It doesn't exist. It's a bogeyman. All the extremes are on the left, all of them. And because they're Marxist, they're anti-God. They're anti-everything we believe about truth, goodness, love.
So Mike, maybe other people haven't heard of it. What exactly is Big Eva?
It's just the evangelical establishment, the Gospel Coalition. So that was a website that Piper and Keller put together, like early teens probably. And I used to go to that website all the time. And they just became increasingly kind of anti-Trump, increasingly kind of liberal-ish in their theology.
Oh, really?
Kind of
even in their theology?
Oh, well, yeah. Especially like for men and women in ministry. Some of them would go as far as to say women can be pastors and so on, and elders. But it just became more and more kind of squishy. They don't like the culture wars. In fact, you'll hear some of these Christians say, if a pastor of a church we used to go to, a great church, theologically solid as a rock, but he said, and this is a quote from a sermon, if you're involved in the culture wars, you're basically rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And I almost threw my Bible at, Christianity is a culture war. Come on, man. But Big Eva is just trying to always find a third way between left and right. And they don't want to be offensive. And they're just becoming irrelevant. And Keller, just as the biggest name was, and again, I learned a tremendous amount from the man, and where he is right now with Jesus. But they have had TDS very bad, Trump derangement syndrome, just losing their clout with average
And I think
Christians.
for a long time, the church was afraid of being offensive, and the gospel is offensive. I think they stopped speaking the truth and tried to walk that middle ground without realizing that we're actually more ashamed of Jesus than speaking his truth and declare we're ashamed of the gospel if we're not going to preach the whole gospel, and we're going to stay in this middle ground because that's what was politically correct for so long. And when Trump comes out and all of a sudden he is the opposite of political correction, I think all of a sudden people started saying, hey, we can actually say that and not get canceled. And the media, of course, mainstream media did try to cancel Trump and everybody else who was being politically incorrect. And I think a lot of people waking up now to see, hey, actually, we can speak the truth. Actually, we don't have to be ashamed of the gospel. We can stand up for babies being killed, and we can stand up for marriage, and we can stand up against all this woke propaganda. And it's okay to do that in America right now. Is that accurate, would you say?
It is, and it needs to be more. When we went to a church in Illinois, and the only time homosexuality was brought up was during the run-up to Obergefell and the redefinition of marriage. And, and it was like, oh, we're all sinners too. It's like, well, really, would you say that about anything else? But because you don't want to offend whoever would be offended by saying homosexuality is sin and evil, an abomination, unnatural, which is what the Bible says, right? And I heard this recently, I forget who, maybe it was Doug Wilson, the difference between co-belligerents and allies. So we were a co-belligerent, we're in war with Stalin against Hitler, one of the worst mass murderers in history, but we're on the same side, right? An ally, they wouldn't be an ally, of course, right? But we are allies with Britain, right? With France, because we're on the same side. We have all the same goals. So in the culture wars and in government wars, whatever you want to say, we have co-belligerents. Like Trump he's not a religious conservative, social conservative, as we would call it. He's way more friendly to the LGB whatever than I think we should be. But that's okay, right? And we understand that. And this is just the first step in a very long process of re-Christianizing the culture. And so we're going to do things with people we may not agree with. They're co-belligerents. And especially across any Christian of any stripe, conservative side, whatever their theology is, we're in this together. We're allies together, and we need to really fight with them.
When we were talking about COVID, one of the things that I thought and I saw, seeing the governments take so much control and stopping free speech and censoring a lot of people, even the doctors that were speaking up against COVID and the vaccine, stopping people from traveling if they weren't vaccinated, stopping people from going to work, people getting fired. I thought, is this a precursor? Are they testing to see how far they can take the mark of the beast? How far the people would be willing to, let in and have their freedoms taken away? Did you ever get a sense that that's what COVID was? It was kind of this pre-test, so to speak, in terms of, okay, can we give them the mark now? Or let's see how far we can take them until we force them that, okay, you get the mark of the beast, and you can, only when you have the mark of the beast can you travel, can you eat, can you buy groceries, etc. Kind of in Revelations, right?
Well, there's nothing new about that. That happened in Rome. I mean, this idea of the mark, you could only buy and sell and so on and so forth. But see, that goes back to Babel. That goes back to this idea of concentrations of power and the idea that sinful human beings want to control, right? They want to be God over others, right? C.S. Lewis talks about this. They want to rule over others for their good, for these others' good, because they know better than everyone else, right? We're going to rule you for your good, and you're going to have to shut up and just follow orders because you're an idiot and you don't know what's good for yourself. That globalism, that thing that takes power and aggregates it into itself, that's sinful man. And that's what's so beautiful. So, you're Canadian, right? And both we and the Anglosphere, every part of it was the result of Alfred the Great. Starts with, I talk about St. Patrick basically bringing Christianity to the British Isles, then Alfred the Great, which was several hundred years later, and then through that, the rule of law, through Magna Carta, through the Glorious Revolution, and this idea that law would be over a ruler, and kings did not like that. And the American Revolution was the fulfillment of all of that. And so we've been bequeathed, we've been given this thing that says power should not be, cannot be, we will not allow it to be concentrated. And that's where we have limited government, this idea of limited government, which the American experiment was as good as it's ever been in the history of the world. Taking what we were given from the English, they just want the rights of Englishmen. And the Parliament wouldn't give it to us. So there has to be a rebellion, right? And that started with the progressive movement in the late 19th century, and it grew and grew through Roosevelt, the New Deal, through Johnson and the Great Society, and this administrative state. And a few years ago, I'd never even heard the phrase administrative state. The bureaucracy, in fact, the last 4 years of Biden, the administrative state was ruling. He was a puppet. He didn't really have to do anything because it just goes by itself. Now here's Trump and this unitary executive, but having power and energy in the executive. The founders said we need that, and that's what the left's freaking out. It's like, we just need to let the experts do it all, right? This is God's providence and ordaining to show us in COVID revealing how bad it really was. In fact, at our church, we went to this church in downtown Tampa, and this family showed up. And I didn't know anything about him, and got to meet him and found out that he was being forced to get the jab, and he refused. So he had to leave Canada, come to Florida, so he wouldn't have to get that. Wouldn't be forced. And that's the beauty of America and federalism. What's been revealed in the last several years is that federalism isn't dead, which simply means, for those who aren't aware, is that the way the American government was set up was ideally 13 sovereign states, right, colonies, that could run their own affairs, and that the Constitution said there are these certain limited enumerated powers. Enumerated means just it's limited. And if it ain't there, you don't get that power. Now, of course, over the 20th century, the government and the administrative state took more and more of that power. But we've seen now, no, we're not letting you do that. And that's what Trump is. And Elon, the fact that God brought Elon on this is just, talk about red pills. Talk about a typical lefty, Silicon Valley guy becomes a hero. He buys Twitter.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just insane.
For free speech, right?
Yes. And the idea, Jordan Peterson talks about this, you can't have free thought if you don't have free speech.
Well, what
right?
they're doing in the UK, right? They're arresting people for praying, for thinking something in your mind. Right. You're getting arrested.
And the internet, the UK, they're not going to get away with it either. I mean, we beautifully in America have the means that they don't have because they don't have a First Amendment. So who knows where that goes, but this awakening is happening all over the world too. And I believe God's going to re-Christianize the world because I'm a post-millennialist. I was all of 22 as I was continuing to write the book. I was thinking, okay, what biblical reason do I have for my optimism? There's one thing just to say, oh, I believe good things are going to happen. And yet I know it's not just us. So I know that. So I struggled with that. I thought it might be in creation. Romans 1, that God has revealed himself in creation and that he's continually doing that. And there's validity to that. But in August of 22, I was pan mill most of my life, meaning it's all going to pan out in the end because there just seemed to be too much speculation and end times stuff. Yeah. So in 14, I became a mill. And for those that don't know, it doesn't really matter, but there's really not a millennium and whatever. And it actually turned me into more of a pessimist, which was interesting. And then in August of 22, I listened to James White give a sermon on something about positive. I thought, I want to listen to that. I had no idea. And he basically talked me into postmillennialism. And I've done a lot of studies since then. But basically, God is bringing the kingdom of heaven to earth now here through us. That's the prayer, right? Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth.
On earth.
It isn't just us, but he can't do it without us. That's what he uses is us, sinners. And I believe there's going to be a progression that this Habakkuk 2:14, as the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And this is happening, Do we know that? Well, we'll see, right? But the internet, the Gutenberg press of the 21st century, the Catholic Church thought they could shut up Luther. And in weeks, all of a sudden, these ideas were all over Europe. And now in seconds, these ideas are all over the world. The Philippines are going to be there to be able to hear your testimony, going back and forth and coming to Jesus. And it's just incredible. So I'm excited.
So it's happened so quickly, right? That some people are saying, and I have a friend of mine who I was talking with the other day, and he said, this powerful move to the right is going to backfire. And it's going to backfire because we've gone so far to the right, we've become so outspoken that it's going to weaponize the left. That when that pendulum swings all the way back to the other side of the spectrum, and all of a sudden we're back in the negative, that we're going to weaponize, the LGBT and the woke and the left so far out that they're going to come back, and they're going to come back even stronger. And then they're going to, essentially crucify the right and crucify Christians because we swung so far right that when Trump is gone and you don't have your champion for the right, so to speak, that it's going to be extremely detrimental. What would you have to say to someone like that?
So that person's assumption is that left and right are somehow morally equivalent. That's the problem with Big Eva and the third way people, third wayisms. Tim Keller wrote an article about, and I quoted in the book about, we have extremes of right and left, as if those are equal. They're not. I mean, historically, Marx, and it just all goes back to Marxism, because the whole movement of the entire, since the mid-19th century to today, to woke, is the growth of this kind of Marxist virus in society, right? And so they're not the same, and there's no pendulum. That person is a relativist. Their assumptions are relativist, as if, it comes over here. So what is extreme about truth, about the truth of human biology? It's extreme to say a man cannot play in women's sports. Okay, so tell me why that's so extreme. Trump says that, right? Last night. There are only two genders, only two sexes, male and female. How extreme is that? The point, how did you phrase it, is that this has happened so quickly? It hasn't. That is my argument. There's a saying about going bankrupt to happen all at once. What we've experienced started with Marx and fizzled because traditional economic Marxism was class-based and economic. That failed miserably. And by the 70s, it was pretty clear that this class-based economic Marxism wasn't working. And when Reagan was elected, the left became utterly depressed. And that's when they started to really embrace the cultural Marxism of the Frankfurt School, Adorno and Marcuse, and I talk about that in the book. And so this has been working its way through American education into the psyche. All of these people go to elite universities, and then they take over government, they take over culture, they take over business. This has been developing for 150 plus years. I go back to Descartes, in 1637 and rationalism, and then the development of the Enlightenment and secularism. These things have been growing and growing and growing. And we've seen the flowering, the evil, pernicious, ugly flowering, poison fruit of it all. And it's dead. It doesn't deliver, right? And so if whatever extreme there is on people on the conservative side or whatever, if it's not the truth, if it's not biblical, if it's not down the line. See, the thing about Christianity is that the nature of reality is God. He created it. The left is anti-reality. That's why it was so fun. I didn't think I was going to watch Trump's speech last night because, I've heard him, I know Trump or whatever, right? And I was so amazed to see them just sit there against reality, right? They're the anti-reality party. And the beauty of Christianity, why it appeals to my kids and anyone I talk to, is it's the truth about the nature of things. It's real. That's why you want to believe in it, right? It ain't wishful thinking. And so your friend is just misinformed. They just doesn't understand the nature of this whole civilizational battle we're going through. And I believe that this is moving, there's actually forward progress. I really eviscerate the negative, unhelpful view of progress in the book because that's what progressives did. Secularist, materialist progressives took progress and completely distorted it. But God said to Abram, right? It all goes back to that. Well, it goes back to the eternal promise, then to Adam and Eve, and then to Abraham, right? He said, all the nations of the earth will be blessed through you, right? And that's what we're bringing to the world. Just look at Christianity and the development of the West. Blessing, as being perfect as it's all been. We're sinners. Yeah. Blessing. And that's what now we're at the next level. That we're going back to find our way forward. And there's just so much to learn. It's just, I've always been a history buff since I was in college. Loved it.
In conversation, where if you look at the nations who really grounded their country on Judeo-Christian, especially Christian values, that they really flourished, right? You look at South Korea, who became a Christian nation, it really flourished. You look at, obviously, the great powers of the past, Spain, the UK, and you see their rise in prominence as also their values were grounded in biblical virtues. Absolutely. And then even to this day, when people talk about the rise of China, and one thing that people don't realize is that the Christian population in China is the fastest growing in the world. Isn't it strange that their economy is booming, and that's the fastest growing Christian population in the entire world, and how that's what the U.S. was as well, right? What would you say then to someone because I've heard this all over the place, where people are saying, oh, America wasn't founded on Judeo-Christian principles. It was actually founded by secularism and deists and not on Judeo-Christian principles.
It's not true at all. It's interesting, though, that in the 20th century, even Christian scholars, I quote some in the book, it just became accepted that most of the founders were deists. It was really an Enlightenment project. So it wasn't a Christian nation, which was completely, the Great Awakening had a huge impact on the colonies, which were 98% Protestant, deeply Protestant. The worldview, the assumptions, all of it. And the book most quoted by the founders, and they quoted Montesquieu and Hume, the most quoted book, you know what it is? The Bible. And you know which most of the quoted book in the Bible they quoted? Deuteronomy. That's what they used. Whether they were completely Orthodox Christians or not, all of their assumptions were Christian. Did America have a Christian founding? I forget the author's name. I have it over there. But he persuasively argues, yes, absolutely it was. And yet you'll have even Christian scholars in the 20th century. And that's just because the whole movement or vibe, as we say nowadays, in the 20th century was growing secularism. And that just altered, let's put the secular glasses on and see what the founding is. And I argue there's three basic ways to view the founding. It's either a secular, Marxist, or Christian. And the Marxist one is, ridiculous. But secular, you just have to look at the culture. When Jefferson said in the Declaration, nature and nature's God, we're all endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of he was thinking Genesis of the 1. Bible. Yeah, that's of course was in his mind. He wasn't thinking of some abstract Enlightenment mono-God somewhere. He was thinking of the God of the Bible. And there's so many quotes. Even Jefferson, even Franklin coming out of the Declaration, we can't do this without God. It just can't be done. That's my paraphrase. Adam said it was this experiment in a republic self-government can only be done by a religious people. Religious and moral people, by which he meant Christian people.
Christians,
right? Yeah. Right? And as we moved away from Christianity, right, we moved away from the blessings. And this point, I use this statistic a lot, that I don't know what it's like in Canada, but in America, 50,000 people-ish a year kill themselves, and triple that number try. That's the fruit of secularism. And then there's tens of millions of people on anti-anxiety medication and anti-depression medication, broken families. Man, isn't secularism great?
Yeah.
Man, it's just because what people really are looking for, and Keller was good on this, meaning, hope, and purpose. And you can't find that in a universe without God. You can't find that in a culture without God. It's impossible. A society without God is not going to be blessed, because the promise of God through Abram, through the patriarchs, through the prophets, through the Messiah, through Paul, New Testament, is blessing. This is why this is not just we're going to go back into that. There's no there after secularism. Now what? Well, we're not going to embrace Buddhism or Hinduism or Islam. We're not going back to atheism, because that has lost all credibility.
Right.
Even the new atheists are affirming our faith, even if they don't believe in it. So what comes after secularism? Jesus. That's it. That's it. And all of life, like you were talking about, pastoring and speaking the truth to these things from the pulpit, I would encourage you to do it. You got to maybe be diplomatic, right? But this applies to all of life. And so on the cover of my first book, my favorite quote, it's obnoxious how often I use this quote, but C.S. Lewis said, he was an atheist, right? But he became a Christian. And then later in an essay he did, he says, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And my favorite metaphor is puzzles. Without God in Scripture, without the revelation of God in creation, Scripture, and in Christ, all you have is puzzle pieces. And you're trying to take this puzzle piece and you got this other puzzle piece, and you're going like, the damn thing won't fit. Your life becomes a Woody Allen movie. Resignation, that's basically life, resignation. The puzzle pieces are just not going to fit. But with Jesus, they all fit, even if not in the ultimate sense that we know everything. But we can trust him, and man, what a difference it makes.
Amen.
Personal. I can't wait to hear your story.
I mean, with Jesus, really, then you have the full picture. At least he shows you the picture, and this is where the piece goes, because he shows you the full picture.
And even if you're missing a piece, you're going, okay, maybe I'll never know about that piece. That's okay. I'm a finite creature, right? We all live by faith, which is trust,
Yeah.
And he allows us to do that and to rest in him. You will keep in perfect peace him whose mind is steadfast because he trusts in you. Isaiah 26:3. That's a daily prayer for me because it's hard to trust God.
Yeah. So, Mike, what would you say then is, what is the refounding of America then? And what does a Christian vision for the refounding of America look like? And how does it differ from the current political movements, maybe of the past, or maybe even what's happening now? And I say America because it looks like the world is just following America. I mean, you're seeing people say mega, right? Make Europe great again.
Totally.
And you can feel it here in Canada where people are going, out with Trudeau, and Pierre having this huge movement here, which I believe he will be the next Prime Minister of Canada, because people have had, with the left here and what they've seen the result of what the Liberal government has done here over the past so many years. And so, what does that look like? And I believe, like what you said, I believe also the world will kind of follow, because the world is looking to America now. As America was beginning to speak up, then you see the world. You see people in the UK speaking up. You see people in Germany speaking up. It might not happen overnight, but it's triggered something, right? So what does the refounding of America look like then?
Well, we know it won't look anything like the founding era because we don't live in an agrarian society 250 years ago, when the Declaration was, declared. But the genius of the founding was a government of truly limited powers that knew its zone. And then federalism is such a key to that because this can't really happen in other countries. But the idea that in America we have blue states, as they've come to be called, liberal, left-wing, progressive states, and red states. Americans are voting with their feet and their money, and they're leaving those states in droves because I say this to people who will talk about California. I'm from there, and I have some business there. The way a nation or a state is governed has consequences, right? And leftism, progressivism, liberalism doesn't work. It doesn't bring prosperity. It doesn't bring peace. It doesn't bring true human flourishing. And that's what Christianity does. And Christianity teaches us, and that's what the founders understood, that absolute power, whoever, I forget the name of the thinker, but power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Right? And so when you give too much power to people, so I trust that, Trump gets that, and MAGA gets that. Where I realized after learning from Bannon all these several years that I'm a populist, nationalist, conservative, or a Christian conservative populist nationalist. And so Jefferson was the one.
What does that mean, Mike, for those that might not fully understand those terms?
So populism, to the elites, the globalists, they despise populism because all they see it as the rabble, right? The people, in ancient Greece, Plato talked about these different forms of government, monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy was the worst form because you just had the rabble, right? You needed something. And Plato said, we want to have a philosopher king because the rabble just doesn't know any better. So populism got a bad rap. The best of America is populist because it's ground up. That's what we are. I have a history book here that it's large. But it's called a Patriot's History of the United States of America. You have the British people coming over and, the Scots, the Irish, the English, and coming to different parts of New England and the middle colonies and the South. And they were so far away from the motherland and from the Parliament and the king, they had to govern themselves. And they had to take this wild and dangerous land and tame it and govern themselves. And that started in 1607 with the English in Virginia, and then the Puritans in the 1620s through the 40s. And this developed thoroughly Christian completely. And so the unique character of the American people is such that we refuse, even though that looked pretty bad in COVID, right? Because too many people just going along. Like I wouldn't wear a mask, and I was the only person in Walmart for a year that had no mask on. But I think deep down, the Americans, like, once they got it, it's like we were taken advantage of here. We don't like that, right? And that's the unique nature of the American experiment in self-government. And so that's critical to get that back. Federalism on a local level. I talk about, we need to be more involved in local politics because that's where it really happens. And so nationalism came out of what's called the Treaty of Westphalia in the 1640s or something like that. And we have the Westphalian nation state. Before that, nations were just a product of power. The biggest army could determine, I want that state to be mine, right? Then you had this Westphalian agreement, and now you have sovereign borders. And this started before Trump because you had that in 13 and 14, and you had all this stuff happening that led to Brexit in June of 16 before Trump was elected. And this is something in the human heart that people don't want to be told what to do. They want to be left alone to govern themselves and live their own lives. And I think that's what America is going to bring, God willing, to the world. Self-government. And that's biblical. I mean, you can't get any more biblical than, you just don't see kind of a totalitarian mindset the Pharisees had it. Yeah. Right? But you just don't see that biblically through Israel and in the New Testament. Jesus I love it because Jesus dared you not to follow him. Right? It's just like, no, your choice. Boom, I'm out of here. And so I think that's the unique thing America brings to the table. I think that, I said somewhere recently that when America sneezes, the world catches a cold. And that's just the position God's put us in. And you can see it happening in Canada and with Pierre and all that. That's incredibly good stuff. And I pray, we just pray it because so we have to work like it depends on us, but pray because, in fact, it does depend on God.
Amen. What would you say then to, what's the role of the church? And what would you say to a lot of church leaders who still to this day, who would say, don't get involved in politics, just focus on the Bible and just focus on your relationship with God. And as long as people are getting to know Jesus Christ, all of that other politics and all of the law and all of these other things and the culture, that will take care of itself. If you just focus on your relationship with God, just taking care of, your family and sharing Jesus with others. Don't get involved in those culture wars.
Well, that is pietism, and it's been a disaster for Christian cultural influence, and it's unbiblical. I mean, it's just so terribly unbiblical that somehow the Christian faith doesn't apply to everything. See, evangelicals, Protestants in general, we tend to ignore the ascension. So it's important to have a Christian worldview, that the fact that Christianity defines all of reality. Yes. But even more important than that, and that's important, is that Christ ascended to the right hand of God, as we talked earlier, over all rule and power and authority and over all of it. And so Christ, it isn't just that we have a Christian view of something, it's that Christ is the king and the Lord over that thing, whatever it is. Business, government, music, art, education, family, and we need to speak to that. To Christ being the ruler. His word speaks to all of that. How do we set up whatever? Doesn't matter what it is. It all applies. He's given us a brain. One of my dad's favorite saying was, God gave you a brain, use it. And he has revealed himself to us in creation, which is human brains. And he's given us the raw material in creation and in Scripture, in Christ and the redemption, to make it all about him. So, it couldn't be more positive. It couldn't be more hopeful. It couldn't be more encouraging, right? That we're not just in this kind of spiritual ghetto, this kind of two-story Christianity where the important stuff is the spiritual stuff. But down here is the kind of material, grubby life stuff. And that's just Platonic, Gnostic dualism. It's not biblical in the least. You don't find that in Judaism anywhere. And
do you were talking about scholasticism before and then came pietism. Do you think pietism was kind of an overreaction to that?
Well, yeah. I mean, ultimately it was an overreaction because So I'm writing a book about that now and just learning about the first pietists and how they took the scholastic and the intellectual and thought that was kind of the enemy of the spiritual, the emotional, the personal. So they dichotomized them. They split them out.
That's right.
Like,
They created
there
like a
is the
false
intellectual.
dichotomy almost. Right.
Totally. But it's totally false, right? Because truth is ultimately experiential. I mean, it just has to be, right?
Yeah.
You can't. So human beings being sinners will always take good. Keller would say idolatry is turning good things into ultimate things. In my very early Christian life, pietists tend to be anti-intellectual, anti-theological, historical. Their history doesn't matter. It's just me and Jesus in the Bible. And that's who I was initially, right, in my early Christian days. No. So back then in 1978 when I was born again. So I just went to a Bible church, and it was very pietistic, fundamentalistic, but it was just me and the Bible. And my epistemology, in other words, how I got to know something in the Bible, was God. And I learned this several years later when I was introduced to Reformed theology when I was 24. It was like having a wire coming down from heaven. And God, when He wanted me to know something, I'm reading my Bible here, my 1978 NIV, and He wants me to know something, and He zaps me. He's like, oh, that's how you learn. That's how you grow in your knowledge, as opposed to rigorously thinking through it.
Right.
And using the brain God gave you and the intellect and so on and so forth. And so what the pietists tend to do is they are always playing one off the other, but all truth is God's truth. Them is a disaster because it does create a false dichotomy, a false sense of the material is bad, a false sense of, like most people think the purpose of Christianity is that when you die, to go to heaven when you die. The purpose of Christianity ultimately is the resurrection of the dead, us, the new body, and the new heavens, new earth, which is this earth redeemed and renewed. So there's that intermediate state, but that's not our goal. The goal is to bring heaven to earth. That's the point of Christianity, and we can't do that if we're in our own little spiritual cocoon. What you do with your money is deeply moral, or there wouldn't have been one of the 10 commandments about it. And, you can just go on and on, but it's a beautifully full, that's why I think there is a revival I'm a post-millennial person because I think a lot of it flows out of that, but just in seeing Christianity as such a full-orbed thing, regardless of your eschatology, it's all about everything. And that's what people really get excited about, because now my life has meaning, because at every point, George H.W. Bush, the first one, had this, I forget what it was called, a program, 1,000 Points of Light. But that's what we are, is everything about Christianity so full-orbed, and at every point, an infinite number of them, it touches. It touches, and it gives it contour and meaning and shape and depth, and it's just beautiful, and it's just exciting. And people catch that, right? They catch it because it's so much better than I have this personal relationship with Jesus, which I do, but it's about everything, it's just, it's incredible. And that's what's going to sell, quote unquote. That's what's going to really evangelize in this post-secular, post-leftist, post-liberal age. That's dead, and it didn't deliver. Now we got something that's delivering. And it was the guy that died and rose from the dead 2,000 years ago. Want to talk about it?
We see that, I think, with pastors from before, kind of the old, I want to call them the old guard, but the pastors or the church leaders who put spiritual above everything else, right? It was all about, it was all about the Bible, it was all about church, etc. But then you would see the detriment of that, of putting a Bible study ahead of your marriage, or putting a Bible study ahead of spending time with your children, or putting church ahead of all of this other stuff, where ministry became an idol. And then you would see these pastors who are getting divorces, or their kids leaving the church, etc., because, my dad never had time for me, or whatever else it was. I think this over-spiritualizing of everything and neglecting even things. I remember when I was younger, where I would talk about psychology to a pastor, or sociology, because I was interested in it, and they would say, that's antichrist, that's too much humanism, and etc. And I wasn't necessarily talking about humanism, but the role of, it's like a lot of these sciences, they're truth, right? I mean, all of the early scientists,
if there's truth in there, we'll find it.
Jesus Christ. Right. And I think that when you're in community, when you follow Jesus Christ, when you forgive, when you let go of bitterness, when you choose to love, when you develop self-control and the fruit of the Spirit, that these are good things psychologically, that there's benefit to these sociologically. It's almost as if psychology has proven the Bible to be true, but the sciences have...
That's Jordan Peterson. Right? I mean, he is so compelled by Christianity because it makes sense of everything.
Right. And so do you think that, when you say that, that is unbiblical, like pietism is unbiblical, what would you say is unbiblical about it?
But that it dichotomy reality. Kate, here's Christianity, you're a Christian, and then all of a sudden, well, there's this material stuff, your job, and the this and the that over there, and yeah, you do it under the Lord, and then over here is the real important spiritual stuff. I talk about it, the two-story reality. So it's like a two-story house. On the upstairs, you might have, like a Victorian, house where it has all kinds of Victorian, and in the downstairs is where you have kind of everyday life. But if you want to get the spiritual stuff, you go upstairs. And then you have to have the password to get upstairs. So it's kind of Gnostic in that way. The real true knowledge about stuff that is of value is on the upstairs. And there's nothing biblical about that notion. It's Platonic. Plato had the world of ideal forms, and the material was something to be escaped. That was Gnosticism. It was a Christian heresy. And so it's terribly unbiblical. It doesn't mean that person doesn't have a relationship with Jesus. It doesn't. I mean, our pastor, I would turn to my wife sometimes and I'd say, that's pietistic. And he's a Christian worldview guy. This doesn't apply. Politics is over there. And this tends to be...
We're segregating. Yeah. When Jesus said he is the way, the truth, and the life, he's everything.
Right.
He is that singularity, right?
I've showed this to some people in other interviews, but it's called The Political Sermons of the American Founding Era, 1730 to 1805. So if you can see how thick that book is.
These are sermons.
So these are sermons. And they're long and they're intricate and well argued. But thank God that America's founding pastoral generation didn't see the faith as somehow only for spiritual things, but not for grubby stuff of politics.
Oh.
In fact, human government could not be any more spiritual, right? Because it's spiritual creatures doing things to bring peace and justice. That's kind of what it's all about, right? Justice is the most biblical of values. And if Christians aren't going to do it based on God's ultimate law, then where's it going to come from? Man's law? And Alfred started that. Alfred the Great started his, I forget what they call it now, but Alfred the Great made his law, started it based on the 10 Commandments.
And I think a lot of kids are going to wrestle with this, especially when they reach their teens. They're able to think for themselves, and they're going to go, how relevant is this for me if the church is just spiritual in nature, right? How is the church relevant to my schooling? How is Jesus relevant to my relationships, my friends, and what I'm going to do for life, etc., my relationships? And I think that, separating those two, creating that false dichotomy really is unbiblical. What do you think about the early church movement, like the early apostles? Or did the early church movement, maybe, in the first century, second century, can you see how they weren't, they didn't give into this pietism, so to speak, that they weren't pietists? Do you see stories of that in your research?
Well, I mean, so Jesus said, give to Caesar, right? The Sadducees, I think it was, who came up to him and said, is it right to pay taxes to Caesar? Give him a coin. Whose image is this? Well, give to God's the things that are God's, and to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. So he automatically said, okay, there's these separate spheres, and you cannot have Caesar over God's things,
right?
Which was truly revolutionary, and that had to be worked out over the centuries. But when you have the apostles, right, they were clearly looking at their faith and applying it to everything. I mean, like Paul says, not only in this age. Of course it's for this age. Christ is king. Jesus is Lord meant that, right? And Paul was a Roman citizen, and he always said, hey, if I had to, in Acts, right? He says, if I've done anything to deserve death, I'm willing to pay the price, right? He believed that there was right and wrong. And it's just, again, you have to see the growth of Platonism and the growth of this kind of overly spiritualized material is bad. And it grew up through Catholicism and monastic life, let's get away. And so it's been there forever. You just got to go back to Judaism, right? They were all the first century Christians, first 10 years, 20 years, they were all Jews. And if you look at the Old Testament, there's no dichotomy. There's no spiritual realm versus everything was God's. And so that's an easy argument to make. Very easy. And again, it's such a wonderful thing to be able to sell to your kids. Because again, not in a million years would my children find secularism more appealing to them than Christianity. This ain't happening. Like my son, I would mock him as he's growing up because he was a musician and he would want a guitar or some gear. It would come in the mail. I'd say, Dominic, now your life is fulfilled. You have meaning and hope and purpose. And he'd say, shut up. But I was teaching him, you're not going to find your fulfillment in that. But if you find your fulfillment in Jesus, then you can have fulfillment in those things. Right? It's not either or. Right. But you see that now this is a gift. The music is a gift. One day we're going into church, and it was just he and I for some reason. And he goes, Dad, I like music. He must have been 14 or something. He goes, Dad, I like music more than apologetics. And I go, dude, music is apologetics. Like, where do you think rhythm comes from in harmony and, melody? Do you think these things are just kind of felt? Do you think we're just lucky dirt? No, God created it for our enjoyment and His glory. And, you just program. That's what we bring to people. It could be our kids, it could be our neighbor. It's so persuasive, Christianity. It's so plausible and so powerful and so wonderful. And you just, none of us are going to be perfect. And bringing this hope, we give to Voice of the Martyrs. I don't know if you're familiar with them, Richard Wurmbrand, and he founded this organization for persecuted Christians around the world. And I read it every month, and it just, it's like, oof. And, they may not be transforming their society at this moment, but Jesus brings hope and peace and endurance, to their lives. And I pray for China. I pray for all the persecuted everywhere, because one day those nations have to become Christian as well. Right? That's the Great Commission. Not just the people within them, but the nations themselves. Yeah.
When we talked about, the coin, right? And give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and what is the image on that coin? And it's Caesar's image. And, to contrast that with us, what is the image on us, created in the image of God? So we give our all to Him, right? In everything that we do, whether we eat or drink or anything, we give glory to God. We don't separate those things from our worship to God.
Way much rather.
I had 20 questions for you originally. I'm 3 questions in because of a lot of the side questions that we're in. So
we should do it again. Well, that'd be up to you. But
this has been brilliant. If I could have you again here, I know I've already taken up, we're almost 2 hours in here, but it's just been a thrill. You guys got to pick it up. Where can they get this? I know you sent this to me from Amazon.
Yep, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. I mean, that's I don't know what 80% of all books are sold through Amazon. It's incredible. And even Bezos has had his red pill. Did you hear that?
I have not.
So, he was with Trump at the inauguration, and he didn't allow the New York
tech giants were there, which was
right. He didn't allow the Washington Post to, and then just recently, last week, in fact, he said he's not going to allow kind of the leftists on the opinion page anymore. It's going to be for free enterprise and America and liberty.
Wow. Bezos said this.
He told Great Awakening. He told the editor of the editorial page, he said, if you're not all in, tell me, please, and you can leave. And the guy said, I'm not. He resigned because he's not for liberty and capitalism, economic, flourishing, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
People are seeing the vibe shift.
Well, when that was happening to Zuckerberg, people were going, oh, it can't be real. Mark this is just something he's doing for Facebook, et cetera. And then he puts out this post and, you see him there at the inauguration and he's talking about how, Facebook will never again censor if the government tries to force them to censor, influence them, or bully them into censoring, et cetera, right? And just to see these tech giants, and even on YouTube, right? Because for a long time, conservatives and Christians on YouTube, they would get ghosted, right? Or they would get somehow shadow censored, and you'd still be allowed there, but then the algorithm wouldn't push them.
You couldn't find it. Right.
No, you couldn't find it. And I've seen this now even with my own channel where, wow, actually, even YouTube is giving voices to the conservatives now. And you're seeing just this move of, you know what, freedom of speech is important.
Right. And these people, they're like anybody else. They don't want to be hoodwinked. They don't want to buy the lie. They don't want to live a lie. Solzhenitsyn, don't live by the lie. So the progressives, Obama was big into this because this was Martin Luther King. The arc of history bends in a certain way toward justice and so on and so forth. It doesn't bend toward Marxism. It bends toward Jesus, toward the truth. And that's what we have on our side. And I mean, wow, that's why you have to be confident and optimistic and excited, because he who is the truth is revealing these things, and they don't have to be spiritual all the time because they're all spiritual anyway. And remarkable. It's thrilling. It's wow. It's just wow.
Amazing. Man, I love your energy. You guys check out Mike in his website as well. Get a copy of this book because, it's filled with a lot of things that we can see is important, knowing our history so that we can propel forward. So make sure you guys check that out. Mike, it has been a thrill. This is actually the longest interview we've conducted. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. My honor. God bless you, brother.
God bless you.
Great stuff.
All right. Bye for now.